It's wonderful to see names of so many old friends and new here on screen, and in particular for me to have the privilege of introducing my dear friend Partha. It's a great honor. I'm going to invite Partha to speak for about, I think it is 40 minutes in a moment. And then we will have questions, and we'll take the session up to 50 minutes from now. But first, let me say just a few words to introduce Partha to everyone. Professor Mitta, I can't think of a more apposite interlocutor and discussant on the subject of modernism and modernity. Professor Partha Mitta is a writer and historian of art and culture, specializing in the reception of Indian art in the West, and specializing also in modernity, art, and India and identity in India, and also in global modernism and the place of India in relation to global modernism. Partha studied at the University of London, did his doctorate with Gombrich, and began his career as a junior research fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge, and later research fellow at Clare Hall, also in Cambridge. He was a lecturer and then later professor in art history at the University of Sussex. As many of you will know, his publications include Much Maligned Monsters, which went through many editions, the most recent in 2013. Then also Art and Nationalism in Colonial India, then Indian Art in the Oxford Art History series, and my particular favorite, which I'm sure we'll touch on today, The Triumph of Modernism, which came out in 2007. Partha, it's my great honor and pleasure now to invite you, please, to give your talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elke. It's such a great pleasure. Wonderful to see you. Really lovely to see you. And thank you. Very kind words. And thank you, Amit. Sorry.
Just to also, I don't know who introduces the chair, but I suppose somebody should introduce the chair.
Yes, Elke, of course. I mean, yeah. Very distinguished.
Elke is a professor of world literature and English at Oxford and is also a distinguished novelist. So I'll keep it short, but that's who she is, in case you didn't know. Yeah.
And just out of interest, because we were talking about the digital and modernity, I am actually speaking to you now from a visiting professor position at the University of Cape Town.
Gosh.
So we're very international and transnational today. Thank you. Thanks, Partha.
Thank you very much, Elke. Okay, let me get on with it. You can all hear me, and yeah, you can see me as well, I take it. Amit, I was taken with your anecdotes about the horror with which the unnamed sociologist exclaimed, no, not modernity. I mean, it's become a sacred contagion. You know, it's significant, the extent to which terms modernity and modernism have become dirty words. We are comfortable to speak of postmodern and postcolonial, and I can't honestly deny that I'm also complicit in this. But we always ignore the white elephant in the room. But modernism is very important. I have been totally read in modernism. Now, if I can put it this way, I came of age in the age of innocence, just after independence in 1947. As a student at Presidency College in Calcutta between 1954 and 58, we all took modernism to be a natural expression of modernity around us. Of course, we were confident in the knowledge that our Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, fervently endorsed the idea. We were all excited by the stories of great dams and community development projects, and of course, Le Corbusier's iconic Chandigarh. India is leaving the dark ages that had culminated in the 1946-47 genocide. Now, my contemporaries at the college knew a lot about modernist literature. Some of my present friends, especially English subject, came from privileged cosmopolitan families. And one of my closest friends was totally at home with Eliot, Pound, and Baudelaire, and read religiously TLS every week. But modernism had entered the bloodstream of even more traditional, and that's very important, Bengali literate boys. I remember, you recall, one of my very young friends in my neighborhood, morbidly shy, his thick spectacles, a sign of his deep reading, discussed with me rather shyly his love of French modernist literature, Charles Baudelaire, Paul Valéry, and Stéphane Mallarmé. Amit, you're quite right. Adhunik has a very Bengali resonance. Post-Tagore generation of poets, Jibanananda Das, Sudhindranath Datta, Vishnu De, Buddhadev Boshu. They're all out and out modernists. But that didn't mean they accepted modernism uncritically, nor did they follow poets like Eliot or Ezra Pound slavishly. Many of you know, in Bengal at least, their seminal contributions. Sorry. So we were like fishes in water, living and breathing modernism, but couldn't tell objectively what it's like. Perhaps we needed to be brought out of the water to really form an objective assessment. That would, of course, come much later, during the 1960s, when I was living in England, when I faced racism and the long arm of the empire against the background of a growing need for decolonization. I was at the right decolonial moment. I feel very privileged. Perhaps it would be called a period of disenchantment with modernism and the heroic figures of the avant-garde. Now, as we know, the protracted battles between modernism and postmodernism are long and involved. I'm sure you've already in your conference have taken up these issues. But also nowadays, coming back to India, I missed that intense discussion, or shall we say Adda, our very Bengali form, at the College Street Coffee House on modernism, ideas that seem to slowly waft through the haze of the smoke-filled room to the cavernous ceiling of the coffee house. I'm told the great Satyajit Ray often took part in these debates with stalwarts like Kamal Majumdar. He was remembered for his work Ontological Chapter, which was a take on Proust's, or we must say homage, Proust in Search of Lost Time. I'd be so bold as to add that ideas of Bengali modernity were developed in these addas. And if I may slightly differ with you, Amit, say that these Bengali-speaking but bilingual milieu and this a vernacular modernity was certainly emerging. And that goes back along some time. Bengali novelists, essayists, and poets had created an indigenous modernity, but as gradually in the era of globalization, their voices were lost. There is the problem of translation for all of you literary critics, as you know. I mean, those which are considered local language and less universal, the Bengali is one of them, their literature remained locked within their language without translation. There haven't been many translations. So in a way, English as an international language has the requisite muscle. Excuse me. Now, if we look back historically, the modernization process in India had started early in the 19th century. Of course, British rule was a catalyst for it in Bengal. English language became our window to the West and to the world, a bit like that of Peter the Great of Russia. But the strength of Bengali modernization lay in another factor: the creation of a modern, secular Bengali language, which could be deployed to compose modern prose and engaged in intellectual discourse. This sort of bilingual double heritage was one of the engines of change that culminated in the Bengal Renaissance. Just to put it briefly, I won't have time to explain. The Bengalis of that period are very much like the Jews of Vienna, harbingers of modernity and all the complicated things. That's because they were there before anyone. So no one would think of Rammohun Rai as slavishly following Western ideas. But of course, now, so it culminated in the Bengal Renaissance. Now, there's a very interesting story, you know it probably. The Spanish revolutionaries dedicated their constitution to Rammohun Rai. And they took it for granted that he spoke a common global language. And of course, no one would think of Rai as slavishly following Western ideas. But the problem is, the West guards, as it were, the copyright to the modern and modernism as an originary agent of change and emancipation. And that I'm going to talk a little bit more now, because my only area, as you probably know, is the visual arts. I've often wondered, why is it that, unlike literature, when non-European writers are able to speak with confidence, modernist artists outside the West are always treated with a slight condescension that don't really come up to Euro-American artists in quality. But one thing I've thought about and my own feeling is that in literature, there are competing canons. But in art, there is only one canon, it's always been the classical. The Italian biographer of artists, Giorgio Vasari, declared in the 17th century that artistic perfection rested on order, balance, and economy. Misura, ordine, maniera. Now, these rules were reinforced by, one would call him the father of art history, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, in the 19th century. With his famous aphorism, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, relating to Greek art, a doctrine that permeated all responses to non-Western art. It was the bedrock of colonial art history, used by James Ferguson and all the rest. Now, to be sure, and this is absolutely clear, the Western avant-garde was in the forefront of challenging the hegemonic claims of academic art. And I not only subscribe, I mean, do greatly admire them for that, but the implied hierarchy in what I call the center periphery, the metropolis and margins, that relationship couldn't be easily resolved. With the emergence of global modernity, all artistic productions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America became marginal to the preoccupation of the core. That's, of course, the art of Paris and later post-war New York and London, and even later Munich and Berlin now. In short, center-periphery relationship, in fact, is not only one of geography, but also of power and authority that affects race, gender, and sexual orientation. So how do we read Indian and indeed all modernism from beyond the West? Let's take the year 1922, very important. which is now taken to be the landmark in European high modernism. T.S. Eliot revealed to the world The Wasteland. I think it was published soon after. James Joyce published his Ulysses. And there's an amusing story of, there was a celebration in 1922 at the Majestic Hotel in Paris, attended by Diaghilev, Stravinsky, Proust, Joyce, and Picasso. I have to tell you, bad news is they didn't speak to each other. They didn't like or had nothing to do with each other. Ultimately, when Proust and Joyce could share their problems with the lining of the stomach, they became great friends, not otherwise. Perhaps unbelievable also, and this is very important, I want you to think about it. In 1922, a major exhibition of the works of Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and the Bauhaus artists opened in Calcutta. To me, it's a very important date. And yet this landmark, it is a landmark in global modernism, has not been known. It went under the radar. So in 2022, the centenary year, actually BBC Radio 4 is splashing out in a big show, calling the date quite dramatically, Matthew Sweet, the end of the world and the beginning of the world. He thinks Einstein's winning the Nobel Prize was the great marker. So I had been writing about this problem, Bauhaus in Calcutta. In 2008, I gave my first talk at the Bauhaus in Berlin, where I said that yes, very important, but it needs to be de-centered or decolonized. And they were on board with it. So eventually in 2013, I worked with a team at the Bauhaus Foundation in Dessau to reconstruct the exhibition, thus Bauhaus in Calcutta. And I think, as you will see from the catalog, we argued with evidence that this was the very first transcultural and transnational event in global modernism. Who knows it? When we go back to 1922, this exhibition at the Indian Society of Oriental Art in Calcutta showed Klee, Kandinsky, and the Bauhaus artists, students and teachers, alongside, and it's very important, anti-naturalist painters of the nationalist Bengal school. Now, one thing I always warn people, I'm not interested in these formal similarities and drawing or tracing influence or whatever. That's not important. So their formal language, Stravinsky and Rabindranath Tagore, had very little in common. But as the curator Stella Kramrisch pointed out, their common goal was to offer resistance to academic naturalism as an emblem of global capitalism. The show was well received in Calcutta, in newspapers, etc., but unfortunately didn't leave any lasting effect. So to find modernism after that in the 1920s, there are three iconic figures, Amrita Shergill, Rabindranath Tagore, and Jamini Roy, which I'll come to. But let me take the two cases of early modern art in Bengal that provide the interface of the local and the global, and the attendant tensions that this gave rise to. So in the 1920s, it was an indigenous modernism being created in Bengal by two of these iconic figures. And this was, of course, the multifaceted, cosmopolitan world figure, very well known in Germany and everywhere, Rabindranath Tagore, Rabindranath, and the painter Jamini Roy. Can I have the first image, please? Or only image, I suppose. Thank you. Now let me take the great poet first, who was also a remarkable painter, but I don't have time to discuss his works here, so I won't go into that. But what is very important, his contribution to pedagogy, and that had lasting consequence. Eventually, in Dartington, inspired by Tagore very much. Now, in 2019, at the great Bauhaus exhibition and conferences around the world, Bauhaus Imaginista, which is a really open one, decolonizing the Bauhaus, I presented a paper comparing the educational ideals of Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus, and Tagore's educational institution at Shantiniketan, which represented a form of anti-colonial resistance that centered on a radical approach to the environment. Bauhaus is renowned for its contribution to modernist architecture and design, of course, most radical and wonderful ones. Also, Bauhaus's founder Gropius and Rabindranath belong to two very different cultures and never seems to have met in real life. I tried very hard to find any kind of evidence, but there is none. Gropius only once mentions Tagore, but they shared many of the ideas of modernity. And let's think about the Great War of 1918 and the aftermath. Two radical teaching institutions were conceived. The Bauhaus School of Art in Weimar, founded by Gropius in 2019, and the Kala Bhavan set up by Rabindranath Tagore in India in 1921, though in very different contexts. Of course, Kala Bhavan really came to fruition with the great artist Nandalal Bose. Now let's take Gropius. In his journey through life, Gropius underwent a number of transformations. He moved from Weimar to, I think, Dessau, and then he left for England, where he didn't really have much luck, and he eventually landed in Harvard. And very much the archpriest of absolutely fundamental changes in modern design. I mean, really high priest of advanced industrial design. People like Moholy-Nagy and others, they kind of were inspired by him. But very interesting, his earlier phase was quite different. And this is what interesting about the life of someone. So I call this his first holistic phase. This is between 1919 and end of 1922, just time of the show. And in 1919, he published his manifesto, The Theory and Organization of the Bauhaus. And there, significantly, he brands labor as lifeless if it doesn't liberate the individual from the machine. And he also insists on the essential oneness of all things that endows creative effort with a fundamental inner meaning, inner spiritual meaning. And in pursuance of this, Gropius then appointed Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, and Vasily Kandinsky. He aimed at realizing his holistic ideals. And these, artists and Gropius as well, they're very interested in Eastern ideas, particularly above all Indian ideas. And Tagore was of course very well known. Now, it's interesting, in a parallel way, at his experimental university in Shantiniketan, Rabindranath created what I call a form of anti-colonial resistance that centered on a radical, holistic approach to the community. And it had a lot to do with the environment, with which we are today very involved. In short, Gropius's educational ideals of integrated life and his dislike of mechanized work and his insistence on individual creativity and allegiance to the German Wegbühne ideals of communal art. So he insists on the particular German Wegmund ideal of communal art, Tagore's holistic conception of what he called the Hermitage University, Topobun, inspired by ancient Indian thought, nourished emotion and intellect in an ideal natural environment, in contrast to the sterile, vocation-oriented colonial education system. I will now take up Gemini Roy, in some ways a very central figure for me, 1887 and 1972. Long stretch of time. He saw through the whole of anti-colonial period and then after independence as well. Now, what's interesting, Roy negotiated the global from a local perspective. And in this, I find that he represents a form of critical modernity that challenged global capitalist colonialism. He was a painter of remarkable power and originality, as you see here. Roy. Sorry, is that a problem? Amit, what's wrong?
I have no idea. Aditya, is everybody on mute? Do you know? Besides,
yeah, Professor, I think everyone is on mute, but I'll just check again.
Shall we carry on now?
Yeah.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Carry on.
please.
Sorry. So my figure, Jamina Roy. Yes, local perspective. So what was very interesting, he represented a form of what I call critical modernity. I've also called it, within quotation marks, primitivism, that challenged global capitalist colonialism. He was a painter of remarkable originality, but interestingly, Roy lived most of his life in Calcutta, some of it in his hometown, in a village, actually, Bankura, and never, ever traveled outside India. Outside came to him. Yet what he produced, the works he produced, were of global consequence. And this is very interesting. It's often posed this question, it was asked by someone at an international conference. I mean, he asked, why isn't Jamina included within the mainstream narrative? So the question is, can Jamina ever be relevant to the history of global modernism? So the art historian James Elkins provided the answer. Roy was only of global importance, and his work has nothing to say, for instance, to an American student. Yes. So this leads to the next question. How do we negotiate the fractured relationship between the modernist canon that claims to be universalist and non-Western art production that's viewed as marginal and local? So one way to understand Roy's position within global modernism is to examine closely the concept of primitivism, one of the most profound counter tendencies in the modern industrial age. I've spoken a lot in my writings a lot. Now, I want to make clear this concept because there's a room for misunderstanding. What I propose bears no relationship to colonial consumption and representation of the so-called primitive people. No, it's a form of critical modernity, a powerful weapon of anti-colonial resistance. But also, it had a lot of adherence in the West. Roy achieved his unique expression at the end of a long and painful process. That's a very interesting and fascinating reading. He discovered the folk art of Bengal and then engaged in a dialogue with village scroll painters, the Patuas, learning from their bold, even crude, and radically simplified lines that created universal symbols. And in this process, he evolved his own unique style of radical simplicity, ruthlessly paring down in essential details like here to achieve monumental simplicity. But that's one aspect. But Roy's achievements had also global implications. And this is very interesting. He developed a complex theory and ideology of anti-colonial utopia. And his aim was to restore, through the village art, the collective communal art of the pre-colonial community, which he said that British rule colonially had destroyed. Now, he was a very Bengali person, and his knowledge of the outside world was fairly limited. And so what he was doing, he thought he was entirely on his own. And for many years, there was no link made. And I hope that's when I started to do my research. I found an amazing link. Unknown to him, primitivists in Central Europe, I mean, Germany particularly, were thinking along similar lines, how to restore the collective arts. And this is often these Marxists, and they moved on from there, and I'll talk about that. I mean, not only Kandinsky was deeply involved with this idea, but the critic, German critic Wilhelm Hausenstein, for instance, explained the modernist movement in terms of restoring the collective function of art. Carl Einstein, who also defined primitive art, and that's another critic, defined primitive art in terms of its communal function, saw the modern primitives, i.e. radical modernists, and the primitive people, so-called, as having similar objectives of integrating individual experience to communal life by means of myths and symbols. And in fact, Roy himself was very keen on Byzantine art because he felt that that was the mainstream of a lot of important art in Europe, and totally dismissed modern art in Europe as they lost their kind of essential inspiration. Now, Roy's use of a pot in Bengali, or Partha, in an effort to restore art as a collective activity, nourished by a deeply symbolic religious mythology, has also interesting parallels with Oskar Schlemmer's murals, very much, very parallel. I would not say there are any connection or similarity. He too, Schlemmer, the German expressionist, wanted to create an art of collective identity. So how do we explain these parallels? For neither Roy nor the Germans knew of each other's existence. And first of all, again, a caveat. There are no formal links between Roy and the European primitivists. Their styles are fundamentally different, products their own cultural contexts. I've been trying to develop an idea, which I'm going to set out a little bit. It's simply that Roy's challenge to colonialism as an expression of urban industrial capitalism, the city, which he was very critical of, had clear, what I call, and that's the important thing, bear in mind, structural affinities with the Western critiques of modernity. I call it the structural affinities in a virtual global community. If you look at the global, look at global communication in the 20th century, and intellectuals all around the world, they did not have any direct access to the metropolis, for instance, but the main thing was this kind of virtual world created through publications, text and images. And that led to this, and it's not only in the outside the West, in America too. That's how the American philosophers, they all transcendentalists, used printed material to construct their own philosophy. So this is a very interesting global phenomenon. I'm slowly developing it. I call it the virtual cosmopolis. So they were creating forms independent of one another, but their works were a response to, and that's the thing. What did they have in common? You know, Wilhelmstein, Einstein and Roy. They were responding to global capitalism. So I wanted to use these two cases to explain to you the global implications of both these figures on the margins. Though Tagore was admittedly a world figure. I mean, he was so famous in Germany. He didn't know who Mann was. He totally ignored him. And Mann was very offended, but he never decided not to go and see him. Okay, so now what's interesting is that there is a problem between center and the periphery and the margins. Now, our knowledge, and this is where I'm going to make a distinction between modernism as an act, modern art, modern artists, authors, everybody, and in the case of art, but it's also the narrative of art history. Art history as a text is very, very important. That's crucial. Our knowledge, our opinions, everything is formed by history of art. Now, history of art, history of modernism in art is presented as a triumphal progress of time, progress through time of art produced in the sort of 19th and 20th century. It's a linear history. So each section, each individual, each movement adds to its relentless progress. So artists on the periphery, Asia, Africa, Latin America, are of necessity behind, and their works derivative of the originary discourse. I can't do better than to quote a great Mexican poet, Octavio Paz, on his Nobel oration. And he encapsulates the whole question. If I may read it a little bit from there. He says, in spite of what my senses told me, the time from over there belonging to the others was the real one, the time of the real present. For us, Spanish Americans, the real present is not in our own countries. It is the time lived by others, by the English, the French, and the Germans. It was the time of New York, Paris, London. I wanted to belong to my time and to my century. And this later this became an obsession, fixed idea. I wanted to be a modern poet. My search for modernity had begun. So this is why he then explains, which I've been trying to also suggest, the idea of modernity is a byproduct of our conception of history. It's a unique and linear process of succession. Modernity is the spearhead of historical movement, the incarnation of evolution or revolution, two phases of progress. So that's a very important issue. And this is explained in, particularly in writings, critical and historical writing, but the backbone is art history. So this is the problem of incommensurate time frames or chronology in modernity, in which non-Western art always lags behind. I will take the most important volume of modernist art since 1900. The authors aim to write an ambitious history of global modernism. Now, one thing I must say, I've had a lot of debates about this. I have to also point out that I do admire their work. Hal Foster, personally, I have great admiration for him, and sort of friend, and Rosalind Krauss. So that's not the problem. They're very well-written book. But even as the title implies, they equate modernism with Western modernism. In an essay on decentering modernism published in 2008, I pointed to the fact that some of the most powerful expressions of modernism as a form of resistance to Western colonial order were absent from the book. It wasn't a deliberate act on the author's part. They accepted what they saw, was the truth. And they're very distinguished, but it's just that they took for granted that global modernism was the same as European modernism, which is always viewed as an unmarked case, as it were. You talk about modernism, which is European, but you talk about Indian modernism, you talk about Mexican modernism. What I found, and I pointed out, is Gemini Roy is absent in the book. So are others, such as the great Cuban Afro-Chinese surrealist Ufed Lam. Wonderful, I sort of greatly admire him. I've written a little bit about him. And there's nothing about that in any book on mainstream modernism. And there are many others. So recently, I've been involved in long conversation with art historians in Brazil, and also particularly Eastern and Central Europe, particularly artists after the collapse of the Soviet system. Now, I was involved with a conference in Warsaw, very important, and there the art historian from all the way from Russia to sort of more or less up to Vienna, but perhaps Prague, they were saying that, they're always seen as marginal to the metropolis, and their conference significantly called it decolonizing the art of Eastern Central Europe. I mean, decolonizing from the core central modernism. And this has been going on. Artists in Brazil, they have been deeply involved with this. Their voices never heard within the mainstream. And in fact, a very, very wonderful writer, novelist, but also just has published this book on modernism, somewhere here, on Brazilian modernism, where he wrote a very, very powerful piece in American Historical Review, I think. He said, look, you're all talking rightly about Black Lives Matter, Me Too. Do you ever think that outside English-speaking people, there are also lots of these movements going on? So there is that problem of language we come back to. It can't be resolved easily. I don't know what the answer is. But in art, also this has this tremendous impact. So basically, these people are viewed as marginal and do not feature in any mainstream text of modern art. Now, the center-periphery issue I mentioned in connection with Vasari lies at the heart of global modernism, and of course is reinforced by the global colonial order. Have I got a bit more time? Just another 5 minutes or so. Now, there are complex reasons why this is so, and slowly major museums in the West are redressing the balance. As in recent exhibitions, Centre Pompidou, on the very first great show of Ufed Lam, State Modern, or Ibrahim El Salahi, an iconic African painter, and so on. And also very recently, very important, Metropolitan Museum of Art and Tate Modern have produced this wonderful exhibition. I hope you have a chance to see, those who are in England, Surrealism Beyond Borders. That is really decolonizing the whole movement of surrealism. So I have written extensively on the need and the process of decolonizing art history. But I will, I think, stop here and not go on. But I'm very happy to also, if you have time to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Partha, for a fascinating talk and for setting a number of different kind of lines of questions going, certainly for me. Just before we open for questions, I just want to check with Amit and Aditya how much time we have for questions here in Partha's session.
We're fine with taking sort of 10-15 minutes.
Okay, good. Fantastic. May I just start with an opening question? And by the way, I'm not always great at managing the hands up, so any help much appreciated. But let me just jump in with a question, Partha, about this. I mean, well, there's so much, but this fascinating kind of global picture that you draw for us of centers and peripheries inside and outside the Anglophone world, and ways in which, as I prefer to think of it, and I think you do too, these different kind of clusters of activity, modernist activity kind of flare up or arise in different parts of the world, kind of through the functioning of global media, I suppose. I mean, the kinds of networks set up through journals and so on. I mean, it's quite a big question, but what's an alternative way to conceptualize this global activity, this kind of clustering and concentration in different cities in, say, the period of 1900 to about 1940 that we're thinking about? If it's not centers and peripheries, and we really don't want that, we want to move away from that, but what are we looking at? Is it a kind of city clustering? Is it a set of networks? Is it both? What are the models through which we're thinking here?
Alika, that's such an important question, absolutely central. I don't have, you have better answers to the question than I am not a person in literature, but let me think about several things. I mean, there are lots of issues. I heard a program on the BBC about languages. The bad news is, and this is inevitable, that in English and possibly, and Spanish probably, possibly Hindi, I can't remember, and all the languages are going to die out, which is very sad. There'll be historic, but that's inevitable. That's nothing to do with colonialism. And the thing is that in that sense, I mean, I can't deny that I have that advantage of speaking and writing English. And after all, Russians struggle, the Chinese are struggling, but they are getting there. Russians have already got there. This is also seen in Silicon Valley. I mean, the Indians have that leg up simply because they had that language. So this is a very interesting issue. I can't, this is my worry. And Rafael Cardoso's, the Brazilian artist, his, complaint is right. But I've spoken with him a lot. I mean, we have very close contact. He doesn't have yet a kind of answer, but this is as it is. And, what do you do? But nonetheless, I don't know how much of translation is possible. I'll tell you something. In the case of Bangla or Bengali, it is very sad. I mean, I was fortunate, unlike some of my classmates, to have been steeped in, I mean, I was Bengali, my first language, and knowing the literature, some of the great ones. There's a great novelist, late 19th, early 20th century, Sharat Chandra Chatterjee. Amazing. I just reread his book, The House Burning. It's an angry feminist track, very angry, totally bitter about the hypocrisy of Bengali society. Wonderful. But who knows outside Bengal? So that's also dying out because younger generation, perhaps good reason, they want to get onto the whole internet, and IIT is very important. It's one of the most important institutions in the world. They're providing all the kind of, scientists, engineers, etc. So where does humanity go in this? So that's another thing. Coming back to your second question, I would say network, city, what alternative? I think it's not all or nothing. Networks I've found all throughout and increasingly very important. You know, you couldn't have had a network the Bauhaus unless you know, if you think of Bengal and Germany, particularly India as well. Think of Berlin. Absolutely. I mean, all this Bengali, you know, so many Bengali students there. I have to be very autobiographical. My two uncles were there, and one of them got quite interested in the radical, but a lot of them were very radical, very revolutionary. And an absolutely amazing place. There are lots of interesting stories about that. But that is a link between Germany, a very important intellectual, you know, I mean, there are a number of intellectuals there, Harin Chatterjee, I think, and Emin Roy. They passed through Berlin, you know, then went on to Russia and to Mexico and so on. Emin Roy, as you know, founded the Mexican Communist Party. So this is a very important network, and it has its implications in India. This is a revolutionary, you might say, network, nationalists and revolutionists in the West. So that's interesting, and that you find everywhere. Modernism has networks. Earlier, William Morris and Kumaraswamy and India, they all had networks. Cities, interesting. I think you are right to some extent. You know, of course, colonial port cities were very important. They were great centers of exchange. Shanghai, then of course, Calcutta, Bombay, very important, you know, the intellectual hub, and lots of other, you know, you then think of Sao Paulo, and there's so many, I mean, Buenos Aires. And so that's important, and how one does it, I don't know. I do feel in a way, I'm very happy. And I can't speak for Bombay. I believe Letitia has been attending it and she can explain more. But Bengal's strength lay in its dual heritage. And that's very important. Multiple heritage, perhaps, but dual heritage. So
thanks so much. Thank you so much, Partha. The questions are literally flooding in, and I'm going to ask the question posed by it's AC in the chat, Arka Chattopadhyay.
Okay.
Thanks for this wonderful talk, Professor Mitter. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your idea of the virtual cosmopolis. I was thinking about how modernist forms travel globally, sometimes unwittingly, as you've touched on, without conscious influence necessarily, but in a co-eval and yet independent manner. So a bit more on that, please.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is a wonderful question, because this is what I'm, well, writing in little bits and pieces, but already I feel that I need to write, sit down and complete the essay, Virtual Cosmopolis. And Art Bulletin had this interview with the art historian Keith Moxey, and it's actually titled Virtual Cosmopolis. So it's become my kind of thing. Okay, let me put it this way, very simply. Colonialism, colonial rule, European expansion has both sides, good and bad. And we can't leave out the good and there's also the bad. I kind of present this as hegemonic languages, the English, French, Spanish and Portuguese. What is their role? They're conduits. They provide ideas of modernity and global modernity, not the only ones, but means of exchange. Now, how is this done? The second point, which I did take from Benedict Anderson, but he talks only about the nation. But I said, come on, look at this. Imagined community. How do you build an imagined community? This is done during the colonial, the whole global colonial is that print technology, print culture, text and images, they are produced perhaps in London or Paris, whichever, then exported all over the colonies. So again, think of the metropolis or the center and the margins and the periphery. So periphery is getting all this. Now, recently, yes, so that's a very important ingredient in virtual cosmopolitanism. But let me tell you this, that there's been recently a lot of debate and heated debates about cosmopolitanism. I mean, up here, the philosophers have proposed cosmopolitanism as a birthright and so on. They've been very controversial. But I'm saying, yes, you know, some people say, no, there's no such thing, and power. I cannot deny power and authority and visibility of the colonial order. You can't leave it out. But can we do something which is not entirely dependent on colonial rule or, you know, colonialism? Yes. And that's where I'll give you an analogy. A very ordinary, educated, lower middle class, I mean, income-wise, intellectual in Bengal. There's so many I can name, great figures, writers. They're sitting in this rickety chair. There's a chair and table were introduced. And he is reading, I don't know, Tom Paine perhaps, or a whole range of things. And he's responding to modernity. Yes, the center, and it's, you know, related to the periphery, but I'll come back to why it's not only one way. So he's creating his own vision of modernity. And if he's doing that, he's all these figures scattered, but they are part of this global imaginary or virtual network. They don't need to know each other directly, but they are linked through this kind of mode of communication. And so that's what's happening. But Elika, you might say rightly, so what about power? Come on, I mean, if you're living in London, you don't have to do anything. But if you're not living in London, like Borges, you have to be cosmopolitan. Okay. I would say that here I have turned to Bakhtin for help, and it's wonderful. Again, to put it very briefly, dialogic, you know, ideas inherited, or no, I mean, sources taken, worked with, and then creating something very new constantly. This is not an hierarchical them and us and superior, inferior. He's trying to challenge that, because in all other things, influence, the anxiety of influence becomes a terrible problem in literature and in art, of course, very much more so in art. It has to be always either classical or modern. I mean, the rest have all to follow from there. So that's the very important issue. One final thing, it all seems to be part of Westernization, but no. First of all, it's a communication thing. You know, that the ideas that it's, I've often used this analogy, waterfall, all ideas flowing down from west to the east, or not east, sorry, rest of the world. No, it's not. It's a whole lot of stream intermingling. Okay, what do I mean by this? I have had a little bit of this, you know, I've studied, I need to do more. I've mentioned American transcendentalists, everyone, all these great figures, poets, Thoreau, etc. It's very interesting. They were moving away from the European objectivity, positivism, and they wanted to create an alternative philosophy. And why do they turn to India? It's not a frivolous thing. I mean, this is one of the great problems. If Kandinsky becomes interested and uses his, you know, Indian philosophy or Mondrian, it's all terrible. I mean, it's absolute aberration. I mean, they didn't know what they were doing, but the real art is very different, rational. It's all, I've had this long thing with, yes, and that's the usual thing. No, this is interaction. And so how did this people like Thoreau, you know, Melville, and you name it, I mean, Thoreau's great, passage to India. Am I right, Elika? Yes. I mean, it's inspired by the Ganges. Now, the thing is that it's new. It's a different thing. But he's reading, and it's a reading and the printed thing that has tremendous impact. And I also found in colonial areas, reproductions. That's printed image, absolutely crucial, everybody. But I was absolutely gobsmacked to find Picasso using it, prints. Very interesting. I thought that was amazing. So do you see, the flow is both ways. It's too soon, too early, but I would like to develop this a bit more. And so that's in literature. But in art, you also can argue that. Finally, one little anecdote, I can't help. I find that wonderful. Now, Borges was an unpleasant man, but a very great writer. He was terrible. I mean, awful. And Luis Buñuel, oh gosh, okay, so wonderful, wonderful. Absolutely, there you are, you see. Now, Buñuel met him and he disliked him intensely. They didn't get on well. Now, Borges, I've heard from my friends in Argentina, was obviously from a very educated family. And he regarded himself as a cosmopolitan, a world figure. Buñuel goes back, his last kind of, in his autobiography, he says about something which Borges had said, we don't say that in Spanish, final put down. He doesn't write Spanish. It's a peripheral marginal. So that's, and Borges, I never knew about that. So do you see this is the whole uneven thing? But it doesn't necessarily have to be, because people in the West, when they take it, that they see this as trivial. African art, because absolutely, and late in life, it was because he was forced to. He denied that he had any connection with African art. Come on, and the great exhibition in MoMA. I mean, they all talked about, the African art was simply affinities. No. So this is what we need to, we have to revise our ideas. This is a great global process, constant intermingling, crossing borders, intermingling. And there are lots of fruitful things, allowing for colonialism. And I can't, I can't deny that, but I would say, let's go beyond that, you see. So
we have very much.
We have time, just a few minutes. Somebody has been waiting patiently to ask a question.
Yeah. So can we just have a few minutes for Ananta?
I'm not in a rush, but if you are all,
okay. So, Ananta, if you could put your question, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitter. Thank you, Professor Bohema, Professor Chaudhary, and all friends co-present. It is indeed a very deep journey, and your concluding quest, decolonizing art history, also calls for decolonizing the conception of art and conception of history. And what you are suggesting already, I just wish to query to take it forward in terms of transcultural and trans-civilizational dialogues. For example, as not only to the meaning of art, but also the practice of art. For example, as Sri Aurobindo has suggested, and he was also an art critic, his conception of art, the difference between aesthetics and aesthesis. Aesthetics touching the sensible and the aesthetics, the transcendental, which resonates with Pitrim Sorokin, who was a great critic of culture and art, Pitrim Sorokin. The distinction between the sensate and the super sensate. So therefore, decolonizing art also calls for this kind of foundational border crossing into the meaning and practice of art. It is in that spirit then, decolonization also has an ontological dimension and epistemic dimension. Now, ontologically speaking, the center periphery does not have a permanent place, because when Jamina is in Bankuda, the center is also in Bankuda. So therefore, the very notion of center periphery is very much metropolitanly designed, and the ontological dimension challenges us to open up the notion of center and periphery. And it is in that sense we are, what is at stake also, planetary conversations as to the meaning of art and history. And therefore decolonization also is accompanied, as philosopher Sundar Rajan from India has suggested, the decolonial has to be tied up with the feminist turn, as you have already suggested, but also the linguistic turn and the ecological turn. So it is in that sense of an ecology of critical thinking that we are engaging with art history beyond the colonial modern mode.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very wise, very interesting response. I mean, I would love to hear more, and I think you ought to develop this idea. It's something I'm not very comfortable with. I only deal with the most material things, but yes, absolutely. So please develop it, and we'd love to read more about it, you see. Thank you very much.
I think we're probably out of time. You could talk for a lot longer, but then we have other fascinating talks this afternoon, and a chance to pose more questions at the end of them. So I'm going to first of all ask everyone just to join me in saying, immense thanks to Partha Mitta for a fascinating talk, has opened up so many avenues of thought, and has got us thinking not only about the literary, but also about the visual and about the material, which is very important. So thank you so much for that, Partha. Thank you. We're very grateful. And I'm now going to hand back to the organizers for the next session.
Thank you so much, Elika, and thank you, Partha. That was wonderful. I mean, and we could have sort of, I was ready to listen to so much more. I had questions of my own. I'll have to.
We can continue
those over a cup of coffee, maybe. One of the things that struck me about lagging behind is, I mean, of course, there are parts of the West, and not just Eastern or Central Europe. British modernism in art is another such
marginal, very yes.
Right,
and they were never appreciated, that.
But now they're rebuilt in the time of globalization and MoMA, and not MoMA, the Tate Modern. They have a new spin about themselves, which is very interesting in itself.
I should know a lot about them a lot. So, yeah.
Okay, so thank you. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. Thank you. And
thank you.